New England, said a New England author, has a harsh climate, a barren soil, a rough and stormy coast, and yet we love it, even with a love passing that of dwellers in more favored regions. What kind of a region is New England, which has inspired such love in the hearts of its people? It is a region rich in a rugged kind of natural beauty. The beauty of quiet groves like God's first temple. The beauty of hills rock-ribbed and ancient as the sun. The beauty of a stern and rock-bound coast. And the beauty of quiet harbors. But New England is more than natural beauty. It is a region rich in early American culture. It was the first section of America to be extensively settled and to establish an American culture. It was the first section of America to champion religious and political freedom. All these things are part of the background of New England literature. New England authors wrote about the natural beauty of their region. They wrote about their own culture. A culture preserved and enriched by the oldest schools and universities in our land. And they wrote about their traditions, about the struggle for American freedom. The full flowering of New England literature is in the works of a group of writers who lived in the 19th century. Hawthorne, Whittier, Emerson, Longfellow, Thoreau, Alcott, Holmes, Bryant, and Lowell. Their works reflect the region they knew and loved. If we want to read about the natural beauty of New England, we can find it in the poetry of William Cullen Bryant, who wrote, "To him who in the love of nature holds communion with her visible forms, she speaks of various language." We can read Bryant's beautiful interpretations of nature in his immortal Lines to a Waterfowl. He who from zone to zone guides through the boundless sky thy certain flight, in the long way that I must tread alone, will lead my steps aright. Part of the natural background of New England life and New England literature is the sea. John Greenleaf Whittier wrote, "Through my being seems to flow the breath of a new life, the healing of the seas." Ralph Waldo Emerson invites us to behold the sea, the opaline, the plentiful and strong. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was born in a seacoast town, wrote, "The heart of the great ocean sends a thrilling pulse through me." To his home in Cambridge, Longfellow brought his impressions of field and stream, harbor and village. In this house, now a literary shrine, Longfellow wrote many of the poems that we read today. In this room, Longfellow sat and worked. Here he paused in the day's occupation to laugh and talk with his own children, as he tells us in the beautiful poem that is known as the Children's Hour. Longfellow's poetry came from his impressions of what he saw about him. His Hymn to Night was written while looking through this window. "I heard the trailing garments of the night sweep through her marble halls." And so, New England writers found inspiration in their surroundings. John Greenleaf Whittier, in his poem Snowbound, gives us a picture of New England life in this farmhouse in winter as he remembered it from his own boyhood. In Snowbound, we read of the poet's home and family. Around this hearth, as Whittier tells us in Snowbound, the family gathered, shut in from all the world without, we sat the clean-winged hearth about, content to let the north wind roar. In Snowbound, we read not only about the beauty of a snowfall, but about the character of the hardy and resourceful people who live in a New England environment. A famous place in the New England environment is this small lake near Concord, Massachusetts. It is called Walden Pond, and it was made famous by one author, Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau lived a quiet life near the pond, recording his keen observations of nature. In Thoreau's book, Walden, he describes the pond in winter and in summer. Out of Thoreau's experiences here came his love of solitude, simplicity, and independence. In Thoreau's writings, we find more than descriptions of nature. We find an attitude toward living that became part of an American philosophy of life. The philosophies of living that many New England writers expressed were part of New England's cultural background. Harvard University was an important center of New England's cultural life. Emerson, Thoreau, Longfellow, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and James Russell Lowell were among the distinguished scholars and professors of Harvard. Hub of New England's cultural life was the city of Boston. Today, Boston is still an important cultural center, as it was in the days of New England's leading men of letters. Equally famous as a center of culture and learning was the little town of Concord near Boston. In the 19th century, many writers met and exchanged their ideas in this old New England town. Nathaniel Hawthorne lived in this house called the Old Manse, where he wrote his short stories, Mosses from an Old Manse. Louisa May Alcott's home was also in Concord. Today, the children that come to look at Miss Alcott's home are much like the children she wrote about in her books, Little Men and Little Women. Concord was also the home of the greatest teacher of ethics in American literature, Ralph Waldo Emerson. In Emerson's essays on thought and conduct, he tried to help people live fuller, more meaningful lives. These young people today live in a world still influenced by Emerson's thinking. He wrote essays on success, books, friendship, manners, and perhaps his most famous, self-reliance. In his vigorous essays, Emerson was expressing part of New England's cultural background. The key to New England's culture was the Puritan background of simple pioneer settlements. In these Puritan houses in Salem, we can see the kind of setting Nathaniel Hawthorne used in The Scarlet Letter, a story of Puritan times. The Scarlet Letter gives us a vivid picture of the character of the early Puritans, their stern moral code, their strict concern with human behavior. These ideas became part of New England culture and New England literature. There was still another great influence in New England literature, the background of American freedom. Emerson expressed that ideal of freedom in his Concord hymn. Here once, at this bridge near Concord, the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Familiar with historic landmarks such as the old State House in Boston, New England writers were keenly aware of their glorious heritage of freedom. As Emerson wrote, "For what avail the plow or sail or land or life if freedom fail?" Oliver Wendell Holmes expressed his idea of freedom in his poem, Old Ironside. In the poem, the famous old ship is a symbol of the American struggle for freedom of the seas. In another poem of freedom, Paul Revere's Ride, we read of the Old North Church. Longfellow tells us how the signal lanterns were to be hung in this steeple, one if by land and two if by sea. Whittier and other patriots are part of the theme of freedom in the literature of New England. That literature reflects New England life in New England surroundings, the background of natural beauty, the background of early American culture and learning, the background of freedom. These are part of the literature of New England.